Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very proud being able to interview Bill Browder in a few moments. It's also because one of the most horrifying interviews I took during my Moscow days was the interview with the mother of Sergei Magnitsky. And that was because her son was a few years after his death, he was put on trial by Russian justice, posthumous. They still wanted to send a dead body to jail. Of course, they didn't want to send him to jail. They want to show that the whole money laundering system the Kremlin was involved in was completely fake. And the real thieves were Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky. The interview took part in my apartment in Moscow, and a few of my friends warned me not to let this woman in. It was dangerous for me as a correspondent, but I only had a few months to go in Moscow, and I knew I was going to leave, and I could take the risk. And there was a mother sitting in front of me, telling about her brilliant son, and she couldn't understand why the Russian law system was putting her son on trial. She was doing the interview with the NRC because she wanted justice. She wanted justice for her son. She wanted justice for Bill Browder. And since that very moment, I'm hooked to Bill Browder's case. And I know that a journalist always should be objective. And I try to stay objective, of course. And that's what made it so interesting to read his new book. Because during my days in Moscow, I was also seeing what the parts of a puzzle which Bill puts together. Because I'm not an economist, I'm not a businessman, I'm an historian of the Russian Revolution. You can ask me everything about the Bolsheviks, about the anarchist movement, but not about business, not about money. And because of the books Bill is writing, I've got a certain awareness of how to become a millionaire. It was so stupid. I'm the only one in Moscow who didn't become a millionaire in those days. But now I know how easy it must have been, but also how easy it must have been to be killed because you wanted to become a millionaire. Bill is putting the pieces of a puzzle together. For instance, let's take Boris Nemtsov. He was the main opposition leader during my days in Moscow. And at the end, when this protest movement started in 2011, 2012, he stepped aside. He told me in an interview that his time was over. He should give the floor to people like Alexei Navalny, a new generation which should support it. And he also told me that he wouldn't make a chance of getting into government again because he was hated by many people because of the 90s, because of the economic catastrophe at the time. So he stepped aside. And what did he do? He supported people like Bill Browder. He supported the adaptation of the Magnitsky Act in the United States. And I never realized until a week ago that he was murdered in 2015 because of this activity. It didn't have anything to do with his political activities. It didn't have anything to do with him being on the point of publishing a pamphlet about the Russian army involvement in the Ukraine, in the Donbass. It only was connected to him being active for Bill Browder's case. This moral case of having this law adopted. And I also saw that one of his assistants, Vladimir Putin, was also in that case. He was the rising man in Russian politics, still very young. And he was poisoned during that days, not because of his political activities, but because of him being involved in exposing what the Russian elite was doing with all the money they stole. And it is said that Putin owns more than $200 billion. It's a lot of money. And it even became more and more. A few years ago, a book was published by Catherine Belton, a Financial Times journalist, called Putin's People, how the KGB took back Russia and then took on the West. It's a book which actually shows more or less what Bill is also showing in this book. He even goes further. It shows that since the end of the 80s, the KGB was already smuggling money out of the Soviet Union in case of communism disappearing, and they should have a sort of bank to restore their power in the nearby future. And I always remember Putin, when he was elected president, the first visit he made was going to the KGB headquarters at the Lubyanka Square in Moscow. And he told the generals of the new so-called FSB, "Gentlemen, we're back in power, and from this time on, we'll never leave," which we know, and we know what can be the consequences of it. The book of Bill Browder helps me, and as I already told, I'm already for 40 years writing on Russia and studying Russian politics, and there are still pieces of this puzzle which are unknown. And I think that's the only reason you should read this book. I give the floor to Bill for a short speech.
I think that's one of the best introductions anyone's ever done for me. Thank you, Michelle. So I started writing this book in July of 2018. I was determined to write this book. This was my second book. I wrote another book that probably some of you have read called Red Notice. And Red Notice was all about my time trying to get the Magnitsky Act passed and the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. But so much stuff had happened between 2012, when the Magnitsky Act was passed, and 2018, so much crazy stuff, I felt it was really absolutely essential that I write this book and tell this story. So I was in Aspen, Colorado at the time. It's one of my favorite places to go. And I was with my family, and I'm normally somebody who's always checking my phone and looking on Twitter and watching the news, and I said to myself, I have to write this book. And I put my phone down, face down, and I made a vow to myself that I'm just going to work for like 3 or 4 hours and just start writing, because it's just so important to get this book written. So I put the phone down, and I spent an hour struggling to get like 50 words on paper, and it just wasn't coming out. And I finally couldn't take it anymore, so I grabbed my phone and turned it over. And there were like 150 messages on my phone. And the first message saying, "Are you watching Helsinki?" And the second message said, "What the F?" And it turned out that while I was trying to write my book, there was a meeting going on between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. This was the Helsinki Summit. And the Helsinki Summit was taking place on a Monday. And on the previous Friday, the special counsel, Robert Mueller, the person whose job it was to investigate Russian collusion and interference in the U.S. political process, he had indicted 12 Russian military intelligence officers. And the obvious question, so this was on the Friday before the summit, and so the obvious question surely was going to come up about what was going to happen. So Putin and Trump go into a secret meeting, no staff, no witnesses, only the two of them plus Putin's translator attended. They spent 3 or 4 hours in this meeting. They come out into a press conference. Trump has kind of got his head down. Putin is strutting like he owns the place. And they stand up at their respective podiums, and questions start. And several questions in, a Reuters journalist raises his hand and asks Putin, "Are you going to hand over those 12 Russian GRU officers. And Putin had obviously been preparing for this question all weekend, and he smiled very smugly. And he said, you know, probably yes, but we would expect some reciprocity in this case. And if we were to provide these 12 GRU officers, we would expect Donald Trump to hand over Bill Browder. So I had, after getting all these messages on my phone, I had gotten the playback so I could watch this press conference, and I hear my name being muttered by the president of Russia was pretty alarming, but it wasn't that alarming because it wasn't the first time he had said things about me in public. But the obvious question for me and for everybody else was, what was Donald Trump going to say? And that question then came up pretty quickly afterwards when another journalist said, well, Mr. President, what do you think about this idea of handing Bill Browder over? And he said, I think it's an incredible offer. Now that really did shock me. To have the most powerful man in the free world agree to hand me over to Vladimir Putin. And if I had been handed over, I would have been killed in Moscow. And so I would have expected within minutes after the summit ended that the aides to Donald Trump would have said, that, you know, you have to walk that back. But no, total silence. And then the next morning, to add some fuel to the fire, the Russians decided to add 11 more people they wanted handed over. If the Americans wanted 12, they didn't want to just have one, they wanted 12. And they asked for Mike McFaul, who is the U.S. ambassador to Russia. They asked for a guy named Kyle Parker, who was a person who worked very closely with me in writing the Magnitsky Act, and a whole bunch of other people, all connected to me and my campaign for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. And still silence from Donald Trump. And so about 3 days into this, and of course the whole world wants to know who is Bill Browder at this point, because no one, you know, not too many people knew who Bill Browder was. And so I was on an interview with Fox News explaining this thing, and I was about to launch into something, and they said, you know, hold on, Mr. Browder, we're going to go into a live briefing at the White House press room. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was the press secretary at the time, was then asked by the New York Times journalist, so, you know, what's going to happen? Are you going to hand over Bill Browder, Mike McFaul, and all the others? And this was 3 days after the summit. And she said, well, the president still is consulting with his staff, and he's still considering it. And I pictured that I was going to be snatched up by the Department of Homeland Security, bundled into an airplane, and rendered back to Moscow. And it was only on the fourth day that the Senate then began to, they were going to have a vote on whether we should be handed over or not. And it was pretty obvious which way the wind was blowing as far as the Senate was concerned, and there was no difference between the Democrats and Republicans. And about a half hour before the vote, and the vote was going to be 98-0, half hour before the vote, Donald Trump meekly said, through his spokesperson, she said, the president has considered this, and he understands how genuine the desire was by Vladimir Putin, but he's not going to honor it at this point. And then, of course, the Senate voted 98-0 not to hand us over. But this is unfortunately, this is the kind of life that I've been living since the Magnitsky Act was passed. And it was kind of crazy why Putin was so desperate to have me handed over. And I should also point out that Putin almost never mentions the name of his enemies. He doesn't actually mention the name Alexei Navalny. He never mentioned the name Boris Nemtsov. He almost never mentions the name of any enemy, but the fact that he had mentioned my name was so significant because I had gotten him so rattled because of the Magnitsky Act. Now, why did Putin care so much about the Magnitsky Act? And this is what my book is about. And this is also, I think, what this war is about in Ukraine. And the reason that Putin cares so much about the Magnitsky Act, and I've discovered this and researched it and have proven it, is that between the year 2000, when Putin came to power, and 2022, now, Putin and about 1,000 people around him in the government have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian people. That's $1,000 billion. It's just an unbelievably large amount of money. And that money has been kept not inside Russia. That money has been kept in the West, in real estate, in the south of France, in yachts parked off the Côte d'Azur, and private jets, and Swiss bank accounts, and boarding schools for their children, and all of these different things. And that's been the whole basis for the Putin regime. You go into government not to serve the people, you go into government to steal money, and the higher you are in government, the more money you steal. And by passing the Magnitsky Act, getting the Magnitsky Act passed, which was named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who Michelle just talked to you about, that freezes the assets and bans the visas of Russian human rights violators and kleptocrats, and human rights violators and kleptocrats all over the world. And Putin felt like his entire raison d'etre was basically put at risk by the Magnitsky Act. And the Magnitsky Act doesn't just exist in the United States. We got it passed in the United States in 2012, but it now exists in 34 countries, in all 27 countries of the European Union, in the UK, Canada, Australia, Norway, Montenegro, Kosovo, all sorts of places, and many more places to have it. And so Putin understood in 2017 and 2015, as back as 2012, that one day he was going to do something so terrible that they were going to go after his money in the West. And he knew in advance he was going to do something like what he's done very recently. And I would argue that the reason why Putin has gone to war has nothing to do with NATO, has nothing to do with the Russian Empire, reestablishing the Russian Empire, and nothing to do with the Ukraine wanting to join the European Union. It has to do with this $1 trillion that should have been spent on hospitals, schools, roads, etc. And after 22 years of stealing from the Russian people, they say he had a high approval rating, but I've seen people with high approval ratings get wiped out in a weekend when the price of gas goes up or something like that. In fact, the same exact thing happened in Kazakhstan in January this year. Their dictator got taken out in like a matter of days when they raised the price of gas. And I think Putin was genuinely afraid that one day, at some point, without warning, the Russian people would say enough is enough. How could we have allowed this to happen, and gone after him? And what does a dictator do in a situation like that? A dictator says, I don't want the people mad at me, I want them mad at somebody else. And so they start a war. And that's what I think this war is about in Ukraine, is about distracting the Russian people. And Putin has achieved his objective. His approval ratings and the level of hysteria, of sort of positive hysteria surrounding him, puts him in good stead to stay in power for a long time. And so he's succeeded. The only thing that he didn't succeed in is protecting his money abroad, because the death of Sergei Magnitsky and the Magnitsky Act and the template which is created has now been used to seize all sorts of his assets around the world. But in his mind, staying in power and staying alive is probably more important than anything, and that's kind of why he's at this war. I think that I'm going to leave it at that so that we can do some Q&A, because ever since I've published this book, everybody wants to know what's going to happen next in Ukraine and various other things, and so I think I will let the conversation flow where it's going to flow. Thank you.
To the microphone. No.
Am I sitting here with
you?
Yeah,
you're sitting here.
Okay. Good.
Bill, it all sounds. Yesterday evening I watched the documentary on Alexei Navalny, and it was also about. I was completely shocked. Actually, I knew a lot about it, how it really happened, how he was poisoned, how we discovered the poisoning. But actually, there was, the coincidence was how he found out who tried to kill him. He got the information from Christo Grosjev from Bellingcat, and he used the same method you used in your book to find out where the money went to. You started at the Gorbushka, this market, in this electronics market in Moscow, where I always bought my cables for my computers, but you also could buy there all the data of Russian government institutions, of banks, etc. How come?
It's the weirdest thing. So most people think of Russia as an opaque, untransparent place. And certainly decisions are opaque and untransparent, and other things are opaque and untransparent. But what isn't opaque and untransparent is data. So we have these laws called data protection laws here, which prevent your personal data from being used, and there's GDPR and all sorts of other good stuff here. Well, in Russia, the people who work in government, let me start out. Russia is a very bureaucratic place. And so if you go to the bathroom, you've got to fill out a form. And then the information from that form goes to 4 different ministries. And that happens for everything in Russia. Everything is documented. And then the people who collect this information, they're paid so poorly that there's no way they could survive off their official salaries. So they all get into the information business. And they provide this information to people who then, for money, who then accumulate it on disks or thumb drives or, and then there's a place called the Gorbushka information market. And you can literally buy any information you want at Gorbushka or one of its offshoots. So if I want to get your bank information, I want to know what you've been doing with your bank account, I can get your bank information.
That's easy like that.
If I want to find out where you've traveled to, no problem. Mobile phone data, easy. And so, I mean, it's kind of disturbing if you're living in Russia because everything is available. But if you're investigating criminal activity, it's pretty exciting.
What were you looking for from the start? Because some of your legal advisors told you to go to this market to buy this information. From that on, you knew where to find where the money went to.
So we wanted to know. Sergei Magnitsky was murdered because he uncovered a $230 million government corruption scheme. And I wanted to know who got that $230 million so that we could make sure that they don't enjoy it and they have it taken away from them. And so we then started to buy databases which would tell us where the money went. And it wasn't just Gorbushka where we got the money, and we got the information. There's something else that's interesting about tracking money, which I learned. I didn't know anything about this before I started this campaign, which is that anytime a dollar is transferred anywhere in the world, even from one Russian bank to another Russian bank, the dollar then has to go for a fraction of a second through New York, through what's called a dollar clearing bank, through the SWIFT system. And so the information also exists in New York. And there's no Gorbushka in New York, but if you become the victim of a crime, or there's a civil lawsuit going on, you can show up in a New York court and you can ask for something called the 1782 subpoena, where you can ask Citibank or JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or one of the other big banks to hand over the information that will help you solve the crime. And so between Gorbushka and the 1782 subpoena, we were able to build a pretty interesting roadmap of where the money went from the $230 million that killed Sergei Magnitsky.
Yeah. There was also a whistleblower, Pierre Pellicci, who was murdered actually in Surrey in London, of whom we always thought that he was one of the accomplices of Berezovsky, one of the oligarchs. And there was this roadmap in New York. You started, what you told us, you started in New York, and there you also found these blocking institutions. First you had to have a very good lawyer, which was this so-called man, John Moscow, known as Omen. Very interesting name. He was the one who put you on trail in the beginning.
So yeah, I mean, so I needed a good lawyer to help me track the money. And I found the very best money laundering former prosecutor in the world, who had the unbelievable name John Moscow. And John Moscow was the guy who said on the first meeting, "Oh, you need to do a 1782 subpoena." And he then drew up the subpoena request so it would be successful in court. But then weirdly, the guy was a genius, but is also very sort of almost autistic or something. I mean, just a strange character. One day he just stopped returning my phone calls. And then I figured out the reason he stopped returning my phone calls was that his firm, firm called Baker Hostetler, had just taken on the unwinding of the Madoff fraud. And they were being paid so much money unwinding the fraud that my small legal fees weren't interesting to him, and he stopped talking to me.
And after a few years, it turned out to be that he was working for the Russians, for the other party, with all the information you handed over to him.
So it was remarkable. So this guy, John Moscow, helps us with the 1782 subpoena, helps us with our initial plans to find the money. We eventually find the money through all this stuff we've just described. We take this information to the U.S. Department of Justice. They're amazed that we were able to find the money, and the money went to New York, and bought $20 million worth of luxury apartments in Manhattan. And normally people don't show up with this type of package to the Department of Justice, and so they went to court, and they froze the assets. And their indictment was so damning, I couldn't imagine that anyone would ever show up to defend it, because it was just like, how could you defend it? And the judge froze the money, and then the next day, when I look at the docket, the court docket, this is the piece of paper that tells you what's going on in court, and indeed the Russians had shown up to defend themselves. And who did they hire as their defense lawyer? None other than John Moscow.
It can only happen in America, I think.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think it wasn't allowed in America ultimately, but so he goes from working for the victim of the crime, looking for the money, to then working for the alleged perpetrator of the crime. And John Moscow, one of the big things he always said to me is, this is a very dangerous business. These Russians are very, very violent people. This is a big endeavor you're taking up. And then the first thing he did as the representative of the Russians is he issued a subpoena to me demanding to know all of my security details, all of my travel details, all sorts of other information about effectively about my personal safety, which law enforcement agencies I was talking to, which governments I was talking to, whistleblowers I was talking to. All the information that the Russian government would want to have to cause me harm.
Yeah, but it also gave you the inspiration to write about these James Bond scenes of you being in Colorado, being followed by his people who wanted to hand over the indictment, etc., etc. And
it made for great fodder for a book.
You've been very scared. It's the most greatest part of the book, actually. Yes, it's true. But it's also, how is it possible? Because also when you wanted him to be removed from the case, you had to go to a federal court. And the president, the judge in this federal court was 83 years old or 87, and he actually didn't understand anything of the whole case. He didn't understand it was whom against whom. He didn't understand what you were trying to achieve. He only listened to John Moscow, more or less.
So this is one of the things. I mean, you kind of think that like the world should work the way the world should work. That like, the courts should be fair, and defense lawyers should defend you, and governments should take care of their people, and so on and so forth. And nothing works the way it's supposed to work. In the U.S., there's no mandatory retirement age for judges, and so this judge was completely senile. And I think everybody in this room understands what I've just told you about John Moscow working for me and then switching sides. He didn't understand what was going on. And he said in the hearing before ruling, I think it's kind of a mean thing to do to take a lawyer off a case, and rejected our application.
And it is one of the Woody Allen scenes in the book, which I recommend deeply. How did it finally end? Moscow was removed.
So by
chance?
Well, we ended up literally for 3 years fighting with this guy was using every trick in the book to torture me legally, and we finally we went to the Second Circuit, the appeals court, the court above the court that this senile judge was operating in, and we presented it to this panel of judges, and they were appalled. I mean, they couldn't believe that this had happened, and they did two things. They removed John Moscow and his partner in his law firm, and they ended up somehow engineering for this judge to somehow be put out to pasture. But interestingly, and this is sort of an aside from the book, that even after being kicked off the case, John Moscow and his law firm, Baker Hostetler, they continued to secretly work for the Russians behind the scenes.
Yeah. And when was the very moment when you discovered that not only these shell companies like Prevezon, which bought his property in New York, was behind all this, and these police officers? I once met one of them in a huge apartment building in Moscow where a friend of mine lived, and he was driving a Daimler sports car, and I knew that the police major earns $15,000 a year, and the Daimler sports car cost $225,000. So I was asking, who is he? And my friend said, oh, he is one of the killers of Sergei Magnitsky. That was the well-known information amongst those people. But when did you discover that they were all protected by Putin? Because his police officers got a medal from Putin when you were already proceeding against him.
Well, so we discovered, so just before or just after the Magnitsky Act was passed.
2012.
2012. Putin basically declared at a national press conference that every single person who was accused was innocent, and at that point,
you knew.
We knew that Putin was protecting them. And so it took me until about 2017 before I learned that Putin was a recipient of the money from this crime. But in 2012, when Putin did that, he had basically become involved at that moment in time when he announced as president of Russia that everybody was innocent. He was then participating in a conspiracy to cover up a murder. And that was the first moment that it became clear that Putin was like really up to his eyeballs in this thing.
Yeah. The Magnitsky Act has also been adopted in the UK. But actually in the UK, the majority of the money went to. It's based there, and actually the government of Prime Minister Johnson doesn't do anything about it. Against it, I should say.
Well, so one of the things we did after we have found the money. We found where all the money went. And every time we find the money, we write a criminal complaint to the law enforcement authorities of that country. We found some here, by the way, and written to the Dutch authorities.
NSA wrote about it.
And we found it in the United States, and as I mentioned, what happened there, in France, in Switzerland, in Spain, in Poland, and Sweden, and all sorts of places. The most money from the Magnitsky case, from the $230 million, I went to the UK. And I live in London. And I went to the law enforcement authorities with a criminal complaint. And I filed it. And first I filed it with the Serious Fraud Office. And they said, you know, this is not the right authority to file it with, you know, sorry. Then I filed it with the Metropolitan Police. And they said, we don't have responsibility for these types of things. And then I filed it with the Serious Organized Crime Agency. And they said, sorry, this is not for us. And then I filed it with the HMRC, the tax authorities. They say, this is, we can't comment on taxpayer matters. And then I filed it with the National Crime Agency. And they said, this is not we don't think that an investigation is the best way forward. It was like harder to get a money laundering case open in the UK than it is to get into Harvard Law School.
Are those people really as stupid as they seem to be? Or are they bored? We know from the book of Catherine Belton that many people in high government offices are bored by the Kremlin. They have got huge salaries from being on the board of an oil company in Russia. Is it also because of that?
Well, I don't know for sure, but what I do know is something really damning, which is that the last complaint that we filed, which was with the National Crime Agency, which is the Britain's version of the FBI, if one could say anything is their version of the FBI. And I filed it with them, and the person I filed it with came to me about a year and a half afterwards, after he quit the National Crime Agency. And he came to me as a private citizen. He said, can I invite you to lunch? So we went for lunch. And he said, I just want to tell you that I thought that there was a case, that the information you provided justified opening a criminal case. And I wanted to start pursuing a criminal case. And I was told in no uncertain terms by the most senior people in the National Crime Agency not to open a criminal case. And he tried to defy them and still do it, and he was told he'd be fired if he did.
Okay, it's a pity Inspector Morse died. Yes, but finally, it was not, in the last chapter of the book, it was not only about your $230 million. It turned out to be, thanks to your cooperation with some Danish investigating journalists, that it was about $240 billion being whitewashed, money laundered. Where did that money come from? Was it all from companies like Gazprom sold for how does it work, actually, the money laundering in Russia?
Well, so what we discovered was the Magnitsky case, or the crime that Sergei Magnitsky discovered, which was $230 million, was one of 1,000 similar scams and crimes. Each crime probably had a different attribute: tax money, gas money, public procurement money, health money. All this money was basically not spent on the Russian people. It was basically ferried out of the country. Yeah. It all went through one bank, Danske Bank, and one branch of Danske Bank, their Estonian branch. And this probably will mean not much for most people in the room, but for anyone here who has a little financial knowledge, you would think the CEO of Danske Bank would have noticed that that the Estonian branch was something like 200 times more profitable per dollar of assets than any other branch in their system. But apparently he just didn't notice. So 232 billion is the number that was laundered through Danske Bank. And this is just one bank. This is not Raiffeisen Bank. That's another bank where a lot of money was laundered.
Deutsche Bank.
Deutsche Bank was another money.
Maybe Raiffeisen Bank, still active in Russia nowadays?
Perhaps.
Austrian.
Yeah, Austrian. And so my feeling is that, so we can prove 232, and we also know that the total amount of capital flight that's come out of Russia is about $1 trillion. And I believe that all the capital flight that's come out of Russia is effectively the same type of money that was laundered through Danske Bank.
Did this proof help you getting the Magnitsky Act adopted in Europe? Because this was 2017. The act was adopted in Europe in 2020.
No, it didn't help at all. The person that helped get the Magnitsky Act passed in Europe is sitting right there.
Sjoerd Sjoerdsma from D66.
Right there, Sjoerdsma.
Goed gedaan, Sjoerd.
And I think we'll talk about that in a moment with him. It was only getting Magnitsky Acts passed around the world. So how could it be a bad thing to freeze the assets of torturers, murderers, and kleptocrats? Sort of obvious, right? I mean, that's sort of a no-brainer.
Yeah. But where did this reluctance came from?
It came from every government in the world. I mean, the United States did it first, wasn't easy there. Canada did it second, it wasn't so easy there. UK did it third. And the European Union, it was almost impossible. Nobody wants to do it. Why? Because everybody wanted to continue doing business with Putin.
Yeah.
They all wanted,
especially our own Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. You criticized him in the TV show Buitenhof 2 weeks ago.
I'll be happy to do so here tonight.
Maybe he is in the audience. Now, what did he do? Because Holland is part of the gas rotonde, as it is called. We are distributing Russian gas all over Europe. And that's the thing we were so glad of, having gained that concession in the past. Is that the main reason of this cabinet?
I can't comment on what his reasoning was. All I can comment on what his conduct was. And starting in 2011, we got the parliament to call on the government unanimously to pass a Dutch Magnitsky Act. And nothing happened. And members of parliament continued to push on him and push on him and push on him. And I'll put some words into Sjoerd's mouth. He eventually went to Rutte and said, well, why don't you want to do this? And he said, we think it's and this was after MH17, mind you. In a moment when he absolutely shouldn't have had any sympathy for Russia at all. And he said, well, we think it's a good idea, but it would be so much better if it was done at a European level, not at the Dutch level. So I then went to the European Union, to the European Commission, the External Action Service, and I said, we'd like you to do a Magnitsky Act, please. They say, we think this is a great idea, but it should be done at a member state level. And so this was when Sjoerd and another member of parliament, Peter Omtzigt, put together a resolution calling on the Dutch government to go to the European Union and present a Magnitsky Act. And if they fail within 6 months, to do it on a domestic basis.
Yeah. Were there people inside the European Parliament who were fiercely against it, of whom you can think maybe they were also bought by Russian government officials?
There was the European Parliament was all for it, but there was one person who was fiercely against it, a person who was on the payroll of Vladimir Putin, and that is Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And the really shocking dysfunction of the European Union is it allows there's something called unanimity. It requires all foreign policy decisions to require every member country to be unanimous in those decisions. And so what it means is that all Putin has to do is pay off one person, and they can scupper the whole thing. And Viktor Orban of Hungary scuppered the Magnitsky Act right up until Alexei Navalny was poisoned. And at that point, it was just too hard to make an argument against it, and it went through. But the EU Magnitsky Act, they refused to put Sergei Magnitsky's name on the Magnitsky Act because they didn't want to upset Putin. They refused to allow the Magnitsky Act to go after corrupt officials, only human rights violators. And to this day, even though every other country that has a Magnitsky Act has sanctioned the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, the European Union has not sanctioned those people.
How did the German government react? Because during dinner you told us that there still isn't a German publisher for the book. Has that got something to do with the historical sense of guilt of the Germans towards Russia?
Yeah, let me just expand on that question for a second. So the book that I published, I didn't know whether it would work or wouldn't work, but it's been a big success. It's the #1 bestseller on the New York Times list, #1 on the Globe and Mail list, #1 in New Zealand, in Ireland, #3 in the UK. number one here. It was the number one book here last week, number one nonfiction book here. It's published in, I think, it's going to be published in 18 languages. And to this day, I still cannot find a German publishing company to publish my book.
Interesting. We should find out. We should find some secret data, buying it in Russia, and find out why it's the case. But maybe Sjoerd Sjoerdsma can tell us a bit about this reluctance of the Dutch government in adopting this law. Please come forward, Sjoerd.
Sure. Well, I think there's a great tendency in Dutch politics, and especially among, let's say, slightly more conservative parties than perhaps D66 is, to view foreign policy as something that has to be very realistic. And realistic means that ultimately they crave stability, they crave security through making deals with autocratic leaders, dictators, rather than striving for human rights and international law. And in this case, obviously, I mean, there's a lot of trade between Russia and the Netherlands, and the short-term downside of stopping that trade or angering Putin is obviously that, you know, the electorate of these parties, and it's farmers, these are people who tomatoes, it's flowers, it's all kind of produce. These are people that are in the electorate of these parties. So it's self-interest, but it's also short-sighted, because if you look at foreign policy through a slightly longer-term perspective, you'll always see that true stability and true security comes through true freedom for people abroad, for true respect for human rights. But this has been an ongoing battle, at least for me. I think I've been a member of parliament for 10 years. This has been an ongoing battle for at least 10 years. And as Bill just said, I mean, we're not even close to finishing this project because Magnitsky's name is still not on it. The killers are still not sanctioned by the EU. And corruption is still not punishable under this law. So we have our work cut out.
How will it end up in the nearby future?
Sure.
But what can you achieve?
Well,
how to achieve this?
Well, if you would have told me in December last year that the European Union would have frozen Putin's assets and the assets of his family and the assets of Russian leaders, I would have laughed at you. I would have said, no, I mean, I've been striving this. You know, Bill has been striving for this for much longer, but I've been striving in politics for this for a very long time. I would have laughed at you. But we've come quite far now. I mean, these assets are frozen, and Putin is now deemed to be a murderer and a thief. So I would hope that we've now finally woken up. I've seen Putin's real face when I lived and worked in Vienna in 2004 during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Where
you were a diplomat at the time.
I was a diplomat at the time. Yeah, I used to hold my tongue at the time. Now I don't have to anymore. But so in 2004, there was an Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and there was a not pro-Moscow leader called Yushchenko. And Putin decided to poison this man. And I was working in Vienna, and my girlfriend at the time was working at the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, the general hospital, where this politician rushed into to save his life, because he was poisoned by Putin. So now I thought, you know, if you go, you know, as far as trying to kill your political enemies, we have to be very, very careful with him in foreign policy. It took me a little while to get into parliament to actually try and enact this policy, but a very dangerous man. And I think a lot of us and a lot of politicians have just decided to deal with him as is. You know, perhaps, you know, okay, he invaded Georgia and he used chemical weapons in United Kingdom, and he killed a couple of people in Berlin, and then he tried to annex Crimea. But you know, as long as we don't anger that guy, he will not show up at our doorstep. And I think this is a fatal mistake, and the Ukrainians are now paying in blood for this. So I think it's one of our greatest political debts is to Ukraine at the moment. We all remember, of course, the association agreement discussion here in the Netherlands. I think some of us will look back at that discussion with a certain sense of shame. But we have a debt towards the Ukrainians, and we need them to win for themselves, but also for us.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Okay, we all agree about that. Let's go to the war. How do you think this will end? This whole system, this whole regime of Putin, it's a mafia system. it can last for another 20 years or another 30 years. I'm always being asked by other journalists, but how long will it last? What do you think? Guess.
Well, so let's step back from 20 or 30 years just to look at where we are today. Putin has absolutely only one objective, which is to stay in power. That's all he wants, because if ever he's to lose power, he loses money, he loses his freedom, and he probably dies. So for him, and I would define Putin, if you were to go to the physician's desk reference to look at different types of ailments, his ailment is that he's a psychopath, based on the definition of physician's desk reference. He doesn't have any conscience. He has no sense of empathy. His heart doesn't start beating faster if he sees a child crying or somebody in grave pain. And so Putin is ready to do just about whatever he has to do to stay in power. So, and one of the things that Putin most dreads, coming from his culture in Russia, he comes from a prison yard culture. And in a prison yard, you can't show any weakness. And so Putin cannot, now that he's started this war, he can't show any weakness, because if he shows weakness, he will lose his job, and if he loses his job, he'll die. So, from his perspective, he has to constantly be escalating. Now, on the other side, the Ukrainians have found their voice, found their nation, found their righteousness, and had some success. And so they're not going to roll over and give away any territory either. And so there's three ways that this thing could end, or I should not end, because not all three end. I mean, the first is that the Ukrainians could win this war. That's not an impossibility, that's a real possibility. The military hardware that we're giving them now, their motivation to win, to fight, they're defending their homeland, they're defending their freedom, they're defending their children. It's pretty strong motivation. And they have been winning in a lot of different places. They could win entirely. And if they were to win, Putin would no longer be in power, and that would be the end of this terrible nightmare.
But how can we help them? You told me, we were talking this afternoon about the oligarchs. We know the oligarchs of the 90s, they don't have got real power anymore, but they still have got lots of money. And we also know that half of their fortune is Putin's fortune.
Correct.
So what should we do against them?
So
Squeeze them.
Yes, squeeze the... So first of all, before we get to the oligarchs, we should supply every bit of military hardware that they ask for. There should be no reservation. And there should be no amount of money that we're... there's no limit to the amount of money that we should spend on providing them with military hardware to fight off the Russians. Because if they don't do it, then we're going to have to fight off the Russians eventually. And it's going to be a lot cheaper in terms of lives lost if they succeed. And then the second thing we should do is we should make sure that Putin can no longer afford to fight this war. It's very expensive. It costs $1 billion a day for him to fight this war. And at the moment, we have frozen about 2/3 of the central bank reserves, which is excellent, $350 billion. And we've frozen 35 oligarchs, or I should say sanctioned 35 oligarchs out of 118 oligarchs. And so we were sort of 1/3 of the way in on the oligarchs, 2/3 of the way in on the central bank reserves. And that's the savings the savings that he can draw on. But he doesn't even need to draw on his savings, because at the moment, he's getting $1 billion a day from the sale of oil and gas to us. And so he can carry on with this war financially indefinitely, as long as we keep on paying him $1 billion a day to kill Ukrainians.
And we also know that he needs Western technology to get this oil out of the Siberian bottom.
So what we need to do is we need to make sure that there's nobody supplying that technology. We need to make sure that we stop buying his oil and gas. We need to stop buying his oil and gas. And that's not going to be easy, that's going to be painful, that's going to be expensive. But again, it's a lot more expensive to be at war with Russia, which is that's the other scenario. The other big scenario is that Putin somehow wins in Ukraine. Doesn't look likely right now, but that's possible. I mean, I've seen Putin fight, and whenever he looks like he's losing, he just does something more outrageous and more escalatory and more horrible. And that's what I've experienced in my own dealings with him. Yeah. And if he wins in Ukraine, he'll be at the Estonian border, or he'll be at the Polish border, and he'll see whether we blink then.
Yeah, because I was astonished to read in one of the Russian newspapers recently that actually the ideologues behind him, they don't think Article 5 of NATO will be active if he invades a Baltic country.
And there's a probability that they're correct. I can just picture that Vladimir Putin points a nuclear missile towards Washington, one towards London, one towards Berlin, and then points his conventional weapons towards Estonia. And then I can just picture the CNN and Fox pundits saying, "Wait a second, are we ready to lose 20 million people over a country that people can't find on a map?" That's what the calculation that they're making, and that's an entirely possible scenario, and we absolutely don't ever want to face that. And so the best way of not facing that is to give the Ukrainians all the help that they need, so that they hold him at bay.
Yes, and we need to do it fast, because it's also possible that Donald Trump will become the next president of the United States.
Well, so
you never know.
This is very important. So time is on his side, not on our side. So as long as he can avoid a coup, which I think he's pretty good at avoiding because he's done it so far for 22 years, we have democracies. And democracies are based on voters who are seeing the price of gas go up, the price of food go up, the price of heating go up, and who are in some cases losing their jobs to lower paid refugees. And this is a toxic brew for democracy, where populism can come in, and it could be Donald Trump. I think if the French had had their elections a year later with these high prices, Marine Le Pen might have won. And anything could happen. And so time is on Putin's side on this thing. And so we have to do it fast. So coming back to the scenarios for a second, I would say there's a 15% chance that the Ukrainians win. And I think there's a 15% chance that somehow Putin ends up on the border of Estonia. And there's a 70% chance that this thing carries on and on and on when nobody wins. And that's another really bad scenario, because the longer it goes on, the more we lose interest, the more the populism comes into democratic situations. Remember, we were all outraged about Syria. We don't even talk about Syria anymore. Assad is still there. He's killed 500,000 people. And Putin is banking, and he can hang on for a long time.